You are listening to a Sunday morning message from River Corner Church. We are a simple community of Jesus followers in Lancaster, Pennsylvania. Learn more at rivercornerchurch.com.
3 weeks ago, we started our Sincere Faith series. We've been watching as Paul writes to Timothy, who he left in Ephesus as an individual to speak truth into a culture that had become noisy and chaotic. And Paul has been there, Timothy has been there for a while now, and it's been a lonely call, trying to get a church started in a noisy and chaotic culture. And so Paul writes Timothy, and he says, look, I need to encourage you on a few things. I want to remind you why I put you there. I want to give you some instruction as you continue to plant church communities and to take a stand against the culture around you. And Paul tells Timothy that all of his instruction, or just Christian instruction as a whole, is meant so that we can operate out of love, out of a pure heart, out of a clear conscience, and what he calls a sincere faith. And he places Timothy in Ephesus to help cultivate other gospel-shaped, saturated communities that are marked by truth and accountability and a sincere faith. And this week, we're going to continue this series by looking at 1 Timothy 3. And we're going to explore how sincere faith is both formed and sustained through leadership that is healthy, shared life that is healthy, and a sense of ordered relationships in the household of God. I said that often I feel like we avoid this passage or avoid Timothy, not only because some of the hard things that Timothy deals with in there around roles and things like that, but I think because we tend to view it as that's a text for pastors or for church leaders or just something to explore when we're looking for church leadership. And it certainly is all of that. It is certainly an ordered way of doing church. And Paul gives Timothy that with great clarity. But at the same time, it gives us all a sense of encouragement and an invitation to live a certain sincere faith. And we're going to talk about that this morning. So I don't want to say let's ignore it because it's just for pastors or just for church leaders. What we're talking about here really comes down to how do we all develop a sincere faith. Now, if you wanted to be a professional pilot and you wanted to get hired by a professional airline, you would need to demonstrate that you have had over 1,500 total flight hours of safety, of good leadership, which the FAA, airline transport is the minimum, right? It's 1,500 healthy hours of flying. Now imagine with me a different hiring process. Imagine selecting a pilot not based on some threshold of achievement, but just on calling alone. I feel called to fly, the pilot might say. Or what if we hired on personality? You know, they walked into the room pretty confident. They looked good in their pilot outfit. They sound good in conversation. Right? Or maybe if we hired them on presentation. You know, they really knew how to put the patches and the pins on right. He used all the right language. Or what is perceived capability? Well, I think over time he could become a really good pilot. Most of us would not feel comfortable stepping onto an airplane with somebody that was hired because they felt called to it, or they felt like they had the possibility of growing into the capacity, or they were hired just because of the way they could wear the uniform or the language they used. Most of us would say, nope, you know what? I'm going to wait for the next plane, right? Anybody actually going to get on that airplane? No, I didn't think so. In 2018, you may remember that there was a problem with an airplane in the Midwest, in the Northwest, from the Horizon Air airline. There, a ground service agent, somebody who just helped load and unload the airplane, stole an empty passenger aircraft after bypassing security, and he took off without authorization. Now, when fighter jets were launched and they began to talk to the pilot, they learned he had absolutely no training. But he had a successful takeoff. He was holding the airplane in the air. He had only logged hours in a flight simulation video game. Once airborne, it became clear that he actually didn't know how to properly operate or handle the aircraft. He tried to do a loop-de-loop. He tried to go over Mount Rainier or Mount Washington, one of those, and look at them. And sadly, the flight ended in a fatal crash after a short, uncontrolled flight and an attempted loop. Over the past decade, the church has suffered at times in similar ways because those that we've allowed in the pilot seat or to shape leadership have not been those that might have met biblical criteria. We might choose calling language. Well, they're called to it. Or we might choose based on charisma. There's something energetic about them. And we look at apparent capability over what we might call tested character and integrity. You and I would not have to look far into the headlines over the past 10 years to see well-known Christian pastors who were removed for leadership after failures of accountability, of financial integrity, or moral misconduct. For example, Willow Creek Community Church removed Bill Hybels after he had allegations of misconduct and there were leadership abuse issues there. Harvest Bible Church in the same area removed James McDonald in the past 10 years, removed following findings of abusive leadership and financial misconduct. In New York, there was a church called Hillsong that had hired a pastor named Carl Lance who was dismissed after many moral and leadership failures. Some of us would be familiar with Ravi Zacharias, a huge apologetics leader who posthumously found that he had patterns of sexual misconduct and organizational failure. He used things for personal gain. Liberty University removed Jerry Falwell Jr. for the same thing. New Life Church removed Ted Haggard some years ago after moral failure and substance-related issues. Mars Hill had removed Mark Driscoll. Right? These are just quick searches. If you would look, there has been over probably 10 this year alone. And this isn't meant to be dramatic. None of us are perfect. Not even good leaders are perfect. And it's not meant to attack the church. But it's a reality that we must name and simply must understand scripturally what it means so that it's not repeated. It should make us more attentive than careless. We as the church and as individuals that make up the church need habits and a shared wisdom that prevent the same drift in our own lives and in our church communities. All of us, no matter where you live, no matter where you work, no matter where you worship, no matter where you play, influence people at some level. And the quality of our lives' influence matters. In the book Multiplier, Dave Ferguson, a book I recommend for anyone to read, talks about leaders needing to pay attention to 4 gauges in their life. Just like our car has gauges on it that tell us the health of our car, if there's any lights on, right? If it's running too hot, he says the 4 gauges that we need to pay attention to are first our physical health, our mental health, our relational health, and our spiritual gauges in our lives so that formation doesn't quickly drift into imbalance or hidden failure. As Dave says in the beginning of that book, he says, you reproduce who you are and what you do. That is not just true of leaders, that's true of all of us. You reproduce who you are and what you do. But Dave follows that up and says, the truth is actually this. We reproduce not just what we teach, not just what we hope we teach, but who we actually are and what we actually do. Sometimes I use a statement where I work at Water Street Mission with the guests that say, you are perfectly designed to get the results that you are getting. Meaning life on your own standards, how you are currently, is the reason for where we are and what we're seeing reproduced in others. All of us, including leaders, have this reality that we carry a level of influence. And we're going to reproduce not simply what we hope we're reproducing, not just simply what we're confessing, but actually who we are and what we do in our physical lives, in our mental lives, in our spiritual lives, in our relational lives. And into that same kind of reality that, hey, make sure you're understanding that leaders multiply, that there's an influence that we all guard. Paul writes in 1 Timothy 3 about the same kind of things. Paul offers these traits for choosing leadership, rooted not in personality, not in platform, but in character that has stayed resilient over time. And this is not about perfection. Paul's not writing to them with a list and saying, look for perfect leaders who have never made a mistake. What he's saying is, look for leaders, look for people who have a life oriented towards maturity, that have been tested in some ordinary and extraordinary ways, and have continually shown lives shaped by faithfulness and truth and integrity. And so we're going to read from 1 Timothy 3 this morning. If you have your Bibles with you, I invite you to gather there with me. Again, it's often easier to find the T books, right? Timothy, Thessalonians, and Titus from the back of the Bible than maybe the front of the Bible. And 1 Timothy 3 picks up right where we left off last week. And I'm going to be reading out of the New International Version this morning. And I encourage you just to pay attention to that one word, that one phrase or image or idea that might stand out to you. Sometimes when I'm reading the Bible, it feels like, even if it's not highlighted, there's a lot is highlighted in my Bible and with notes, but sometimes there will be a section that's not highlighted, and when I'm reading it, it feels like God in some way just highlights it. There's a brighter sense to it, and I'm drawn into that word. And I tell people, when you're reading the scriptures, pay attention to the stops, to the places like that where it feels like it's highlighted and God is drawing you in some way, because there might be something there for you to explore. It's one of the clearest ways to understand the voice of God is to see where he stops you when you're reading the scriptures. 1 Timothy 3 reads like this. Here is a trustworthy saying. Whoever aspires to be an overseer desires a noble task. Now the overseer is to be above reproach, faithful to his wife, temperate, self-controlled, respectable, hospitable, able to teach, not given to drunkenness, not violent but gentle, not quarrelsome, not a lover of money. He must manage his own family well and see that his children obey him. And he must do so in a manner worthy of full respect. If anyone does not know how to manage his own family, how can he take care of God's church? He must not be a recent convert, or he may become conceited and fall under the same judgment as the devil. He must also have a good reputation with outsiders so that he will not fall into disgrace and into the devil's trap. In the same way, deacons are to be worthy of respect, sincere, not indulging in much wine, and not pursuing dishonest gain. They must keep hold of the deep truths of the faith with a clear conscience. They must be tested, and then, if there's nothing against them, let them serve as deacons. In the same way, the women are to be worthy of respect, not malicious talkers, but temperate and trustworthy in everything. A deacon must be faithful to his wife and must manage his children and his household well. Those who have served well gain an excellence in standing and great assurance in their faith in Christ Jesus. Although I hope to come to you soon, I'm writing you these instructions so that if I'm delayed, you will know how people ought to conduct themselves in God's household, which is the church of the living God, the pillar and foundation of all the truth. Right? That's an important stuff. Let me just stop there. That's an important confession to what the church's role is in shaping sincere faith. The church is a household, which is the church of the living God, the household of the living God, the called out community of those who are part of a living God, and that needs to become a pillar and a foundation in a noisy and chaotic world for what truth is. Beyond all question, he continues in verse 16, the mystery from which true godliness springs is great. He appeared in the flesh, was vindicated by the Spirit, was seen by angels, was preached among the nations, was believed on in the world, was taken up in glory. In 1 Timothy 3, Paul begins to unpack a look at what the NIV translates as overseers. He's beginning to get to that by saying, here's a trustworthy statement. Or quite more literally in the Greek, it would say, here is a word, it's actually logos there, that you can have faith in. It's pistis. It's a sense that you can have faith in this statement. And he addresses overseers. You can have faith in what I'm about to tell you as a way of living, a framework by which the church should be living. And Craig Keener points out that the term translated overseer, you'll find that in the NIV, in the NASB, or bishop, which you'll find in the King James Version or other versions like the NRSV, is used elsewhere at this time in Near Eastern writings in the ancient world simply for leaders. Paul is using it similarly to how we'd use the word elder, as in Titus 1:5 and 7. It's a leadership title that was used in synagogues. Again, a reminder, synagogues happened wherever there was at least 10 families in a city, and there would be a Jewish synagogue that was set up. There were different levels of leaders that would take place in there, and the main leader, the teaching leader in there, would have been a similar word, a derivative of this word that Paul is using here for the Christian church. And sometimes what we're seeing here is that we tend to see the word overseer and we think extra high or presidential, or we tend to think of like a bishop. As we hear this opening statement, we might also be unfair with our reading of it and say, well, I'm not an overseer, and so it doesn't apply to me. But it's helpful to know that the word overseer implies, the person who's looking to be an overseer implies anyone that has a level of responsibility or influence. We'll come back to that in a little bit. But it's important for us to read this and not just think of a bishop as we tend to understand it in our world. In fact, we belong to a network of churches where there is a bishop or an overseer. And these are kind of pastors of pastors that oversee a region or a district. They serve as encouragers, they serve as accountability partners, they serve as resource providers, but they're also kind of just a pastor to pastors, keeping them accountable. James, the brother of Jesus, seems to occupy historically a kind of a role like that. He is in charge of the Jerusalem churches. They come to him for problems. He writes resources for them. He resolves problems. But there's also an additional council that he participates in, as we saw in our Acts study, where the council helps decide certain matters. And we kind of liken that to a denomination, but that also taints it at some level. But the point is, the council is kind of where the buck stops. And then locally, you have your overseers, your lead pastors. Excuse me. So when we think about what Paul's saying here, allow that to influence you, but not narrow the passage for you. This is completely about the local church. Paul's not speaking about a regional overseer. He is that regional overseer. But he's instructing us on what everyday church looks like for us. He's setting values and virtues and character and calling that apply, yes, to church leaders, but even more broadly than that. These virtues, character, and calling also apply to any of us who lead, influence, and carry responsibility in the local churches or in places that we live, that we work, or that we play. And what should our church overseers look like? What should a person who desires responsibility or influence or overseeing look like? This is what Paul's intent is. And first he says they must be above reproach, or they must not be open to blame. That's what reproach means. It's a sense that they must be faithful to a life of integrity. That if you examine their lives, you see that at the end of the day, they're not hiding anything in a closet. They are truly pushing for integrity. Second, he says that they should have one wife. In fact, if you would translate the Greek literally, which I think is fun to do sometimes, it's one woman man. He must be a man with a one-woman man. And that's probably the most literal translation of it. And some have struggled with Paul's exact intent here. Some emphasize that he's talking about marital faithfulness. And others say, well, maybe he's talking about how many in this culture could have been divorced or kind of loose and promiscuous. And the language here we must face is clearly male. We can't avoid that fact. Even as we talked about last week and looked at the second passage, if we believe some overseers can be female, we have to look at what's happening here. And this is a very masculine term in the Greek. It says that overseers must live lives of integrity. Paul continues that thought here. They must have integrity in their marriage to their wives. That's his point. How they live towards their spouse in faithful ways matters. Third, they must be temperate regarding alcohol, yes, but in all areas of life. Free from the domination of intoxicating influences, including other intoxicating influences like others in your life. If somebody allows people to whisper in their ear, that applies to what it means to be sober in this word that Paul is talking about. He wants people that can think clearly, that can make wise choices, and avoid addictions that control their lives. The King James Version uses the word vigilant here. And I think that translation is more interpretive than necessary. Yes, it is a sense of vigilance, but it's actually a sense of sober-mindedness where other people and addictive sources are not influencing the way you see things. Then he goes on, he says, look, you must also have self-control. The King James uses the word sober here, They render it self-controlled in the NIV. It's sensible or self-controlled as common translations use. And this trait points to emotional steadiness. It means that they're not going to be a hot head. They're not going to be losing their cool all the time. They are to demonstrate faithfulness and integrity in their commitments, but also in their emotions, how they live their emotional lives. They are to live then with integrity, with a sense of responsibility and order. They must not create chaos. They must not live irresponsibly. Paul's sixth trait that he goes into is hospitality. They must love to welcome guests. Likely, I think Paul means both into the church community, which is going to be in somebody's home, where hospitality is really important, but also into their own home. In fact, the compound word that Paul uses for they must be lovers of hospitality or love to extend hospitality really just means they must be a lover of strangers or a lover of guests. And so I want you to notice something really important here. We've already gotten pretty far into Paul's list, but I bet what you don't notice is what's not there. Paul has not talked about capacity or capability yet. He also has only briefly mentioned calling, if anyone wants to be an overseer, and then begins his trait list. Most of the Western church has often settled for calling, for charisma, for capacity, and contagiousness, rather than character shaped by spiritual growth. Now, Paul moves into something we might have expected at the beginning of the list. Seventh, overseers must be able to teach. So now he's finally getting into, briefly, some of that capacity or capability in a person. They must be able to teach. And the word there means they must be skillful communicators of truth. People should be able to understand them. Right? They don't all have to be the most amazing orator in the world, but they must be able to speak the truth faithfully and faithfully in a way that people understand them. They must know what they're talking about, right? You can't lead where you've never been led yourself. And that's kind of what Paul's getting at here. And then he returns again to character, right? He gives us one trait of what calling and capacity looks like, and now he's going to go back into character. And at the top of the list, he seems to address alcohol once more. Paul says, look, he already said you must be sober-minded from all influences, and so now he uses a word which speaks specifically to alcohol and to being clear-minded judgment and decision. He says, look, they must not, and it doesn't say ever have, right? It's not that you can't just have a glass of wine here and there. He's saying they mustn't be given over to drunkenness. They mustn't live their lives dictated by alcohol. And Paul mentions this in Titus too. And it's really important to know that in Ephesus, where Timothy is, and in Crete, where Titus is, there's a lot of alcohol happening. There is a lot of celebrations happening. This isn't just like with dinner. They're going out and having block parties that get out of hand. And so Paul's saying, look, you have to understand, when God transforms us, he transforms our old culture as well. And so the point is that an overseer, the leaders in the church, should not be known as someone who is controlled by alcohol or making foolish or shameful decisions because of their addiction to alcohol. And then he says they mustn't be violent, or I think better, they mustn't be a bully, but they must be gentle and considerate. And I think that's a fair translation of the idea. Paul wants them to understand that leadership is not just brute force. Again, this is important because if you remember the first week, we talked about something that was happening in Ephesus. Timothy tells them, I don't want men raising their hands anymore in dispute. I want them to raise their hands in prayer. He plays on this word that if we're going to raise our hands, it's not for the division of the world around us, but that we're going to give over to gentleness, to prayer. And so he says that must be here too. That thing that we want the whole church to look like needs to be modeled in the leadership. And that's the real issue in the context. Is the leader casting a vision for where the church should go? And Paul's also describing a personality trait here. They mustn't be quarrelsome. So they mustn't be ready to duke it out, right? We don't need John Wayne and some of those kind of movies or Dirty Harry movies, right? We don't need that kind of pastoral leader. But we also want someone who's not quarrelsome. And what that is someone who just loves to debate, or someone who just loves to create conflict. And so there's this really tension here. They must be able to step into conflict. They must be able to name what's going on in conflict and address conflict without getting, fist up. But they also must not just like to create conflict for no reason. And then he goes into this. He says, rather, they're to be peaceable in their personality, their gentleness, their interaction, including their homes and their relationships. And they must not love money. At some level, I think all of us love money. We desire for more money. We always think, man, if I could just have a little bit more money, then this area of my life would be all right. It never seems that we have enough of it. But Paul's speaking about a deeper craving than just saying, man, I need to make some more money. He's talking about that restless hunger in us that always wants bigger, better, and more. And not just in our own lives, but in our church, to where we're willing to trespass over other people. We're willing to pursue bigger and better at the cost of hurting people. Overseers are not to be driven by greed, either for wealth or for bigger platforms. Their character must be shaped by faithfulness to the mission rather than devotion to the mercy. A few years ago, I was at a pastor's conference at a funeral home. Kind of a weird place for a pastor's conference, but it was really good. And the guy spoke up and he said, how many of you have ever pastored a small church? And quite a few people raised their hand. And he said, how many of you have ever got upset when a smaller church has lost people to a larger church? Again, lots of hands went up. And he says, it seems like when people feel God calls them somewhere, he never calls them to smaller churches. And everyone kind of laughed about it. And as they were laughing, he said, but the same is true of pastors. He said, how many pastors do you know that have modeled downward mobility? That have said, I don't want bigger and better. I'm not working faithfully here so that I can go on to another stage. He says, how many pastors you know have left a large church to go to a smaller church? And the reality he was challenging in us is that as Americans, as Western people, we often want bigger and better. We want more. And that's at the heart of this do not be lovers of money thing. It's more than just money. It's a sense of wanting bigger and better. And the gospel writers actually describe Judas in this way. They say he was a lover of money. We didn't know it then, but he loved to have his hand in the pocketbook, right? There's all these little comments that they make letting us know what kind of character trait Judas was. Just as our own culture is obsessed with bigger and better, theirs was too. The church needs leaders who are not captivated by these desires. And Paul's not done with the list. Again, he says, look, I'm not asking you to know how to manage a website or go viral on TikTok. I'm not asking you to know how to grow numbers. There's no numerical talk in this at all. He's saying, I'm not asking you to have an MBA, even though I do have one, right, for business sake. He's not asking those kind of traits that we often look in. Paul's not focused on platform building or outward success. It's character, character, and character before capacity and capability. That's not to say that capability and capacity and calling or other desired leadership traits are not bad, but they don't matter as much. They are second. They can be developed, taught, compensated for. In the very least, they are secondary. And Paul gives us this litmus test here. He says, if a person is desiring influence and responsibility, look at how they direct their own household. If their kids are out of control, there's a problem. His point is that an overseer must provide direction to the family towards faithful living, cultivating obedience alongside honor and respect. The household displays the fruit of that person's leadership. Well, why does that matter so much? Well, first, it is a field test. It tells us, hey, is this person really working for what they say they're working for? But Craig Keener points out this too. This factor was especially important for leaders of churches who were meeting in their own homes or in others' homes. And so we find this fact that the household, and we talked about this last week, is compared to the church. It is interesting that Paul inserts a commentary line here in the middle of his list. So far he's been just going A, B, C, D, E, F. But here he puts this explanation, commentary, tangent after his point. He says, you know, if they can't do this, then they can't do this. And his point is that he really wants to drive that point home, because I suspect in that context that was a real problem. Somebody who can't guide their own household as a spiritual father or mother isn't fit to serve in the church as a spiritual father or mother. After this, Paul begins to give a couple more practical things with explanation. An overseer can't be a new follower of Jesus. That's just common sense. But you know what? In a community like Ephesus, where people are coming face to face with Jesus regularly, where they're confessing the faith and coming in, and the church needs a lot of help to keep it going, it must have been really tempted to take contagious over resilient and tested, right? And so Paul reminds them. He says, look, they can fall into malicious traps just like the devil. He also says they must have a reputation that's good in the community. A few years ago, I was watching a video out at the Mennonite Historical Society, and they interviewed this Amish guy in the video, and he said, someone said, "Are you a Christian?" And his response, which has some weakness, but I love the way it preaches here, he said, "I don't know, ask my neighbor." That is a great line. What would your neighbor say about you? What does the community say about you as a leader, as an influence? Are you a Christian? That looks like how outsiders speak about you. Are you a leader? Do others recognize that leadership in you? Paul's getting to that point right here. He says, look, I placed you, Timothy, in order to help cultivate and order the church. And this is how you do it. Now, the other thing that I want to just touch on briefly here is we tend to read passages like this and we see he must. And what we tend to think of is that there's a singular leader that Paul is calling Timothy to set up. And I want to push back on that idea, because we've gotten the idea of senior leader out of that, but it's not in the text. Remember, the senior leader in this context is who? It's Timothy. Paul's put Timothy there. What has Timothy been entrusted to do? To preach and teach and to call new leaders up. From the start, Paul wants a multi-voice leadership team. And additionally, that's kind of Paul's MO everywhere he goes. He always sets up several leaders. When he goes on the road, he takes several people with him. When Jesus started his ministry, he called how many people to his side? 12. And so here, though it's tempted to look at it in a singular way, we need to remember what he's doing. He's setting up a community where leadership is to be shared. The church was never meant to rest on the shoulders of one personality. And when we let it happen, then we get into some of the problems that we saw with the church is that I named at the beginning of this. Here, we must look at it as a plural of informed and character-driven leaders. Paul then continues to go into deacons, those who serve the church. A deacon is a trusted servant, someone who helps care for others, someone who differentiated because of the capacity in their life. Scholars point out that he's using a synagogue word here too. He's playing on the idea of how synagogues had the teaching leaders, but they also had sharzans, or these individuals that help maintain the day-to-day of the synagogue. And unlike elders, which are the overseers, the deacon tends to do more of a plural or kind of a administrative function, much more than public teaching. And so that pattern matters. There are overseers or elders who shepherd and guide church communities who are meant to strengthen the church community. When I was growing up, my father served as a deacon in our church, right? His job was to count the offering. He helped collect it. He served in practical ways within the church. And that's a beautiful image, but I kind of push back on deacon as a role or overseer as a role. I think we need to be careful that we're not setting up hierarchy. We're setting up shepherding reasons so that the church can reach its fullness. It's certainly a recognized role and a responsibility role. We should ordain, call out, name what God is doing in people, but they're not just merely food committee. They're trusted people who are leading in meaningful ways. They're deacons not because they're hired hands or a professional role, but because we see the integrity and the calling in their lives that set them apart. These are servants who recognize their role in the church and outside of the work, and outside of the church as well. And Paul says these people should be tested or examined first. That means they should be affirmed by the church, but then carefully brought through prayer and discussion and discernment. They shouldn't be just appointed hastily. We're certainly ordaining or calling out these giftings in people, but not for power, for prestige, but so they can help steward the community. And so as long as there's no credible accusation raised against them, Paul's like, release them into the ministry. We need more people serving the church. Again, multiple voices leading the church. And then we come to an interesting debated part. While addressing deacons, Paul then switches to women. Some versions might say wives. And that's because the word for woman and wife in this part is exactly the same. And so is Paul talking now about the deacons' wives, or is he talking about deaconesses? And I'll let you guys fight that out later, but not by raising your hands, okay? And so the scholars debate, is he talking about female deacons, which the early church certainly had, deaconesses, or is he talking about the deacons' wives, who also must look a certain way? Here's a few things worth noting. The church is a family. We've discussed this. It's a mirror of household relationship. If Paul intends this to be deacons' wives, then it still shows us that no leader operates in a vacuum. Their spouse participates in the life and the witness of the community, and Paul expects these women to model the same qualities. At the same time, there's legitimate reasons to consider that Paul's speaking about female servants or deaconesses. They existed in the early church. He says in the same way, which is indicating a parallel role rather than just describing spouses. But the emphasis is the same. The church needs to live in a certain way that models to the rest of the church a certain thing. Paul again returns to the deacons and says, look, they too must maintain their households well. And here he clearly does talk about their wives. He doesn't have the clarifier on the word to make it a deacon's wives earlier, which is why I lean to see that as deaconesses. But here Paul says, even their household with their wives must live faithfully into these things. Now, I want to push back one last time on seeing these as power structures. Elsewhere, Paul levels the playing field. He says, when you come to church, everyone brings a song, everyone brings a scripture, everyone brings a testimony. And I believe Paul's emphasis is less about status and more about responsibility, service, calling, and character. Leadership in the early church is not meant to be the leadership grab that we have made it often in the West. It's about being differentiated only because of your integrity, your faithfulness, and your service. And Paul then shifts quite rapidly in this text. He says, look, I know what I just said is a lot, and I know you got a lot of questions, and I need to explain it more. I'm hoping to get into town, but if I don't, this list will be good enough to get you going, to know how to conduct yourselves in, and know what the NIV says, in God's household. The word there is oikos. It was the same word used to describe your house. But it didn't just represent your house. It represented your cousins and your aunts and your uncles, those people, maybe if you had house servants that lived with you, all of that was part of your oikos. And as the father, you were responsible for it. Paul's saying, look, here, the oikos, the household, is to be modeled on the household, as we've seen throughout 1 Timothy. Paul's pointing to the church as a family. Some are going to serve as spiritual mothers and fathers that help hold the community together. And then he gives this almost mission statement. At the center of it is this pillar and foundation of truth, what stabilizes us. He calls us to this kind of creedal statement. And that's important because a lot of scholars say what he's quoting is a mission statement or a creed that Paul and Timothy probably knew really well, or he's quoting from a hymn that the early church would have sung. More and more people are seeing it as a hymn. And so these are lyrics that would have kept them centered. But at the core, they are to be distinguished, these deacons and the overseers, by the way they live and the resilience of their faith. And here's the question. What does that matter for you and me? If you're not an overseer, if you're not a deacon, what does that matter? Well, one scholar remarks all Christians have a leadership role. Regardless of their place in the organization, executives usually have the greatest opportunity, certainly, to shape the strategy and the structure of an organization. But all workers have continual opportunities to develop good relationships, produce excellent products and services, act with integrity, help others develop their abilities, and shape the culture of their immediate work groups. Paul calls us all to live with integrity, to carry responsibility and integrity in all the places we have influence, because doing so puts God on display. All of this is meant to give a sincere faith. As Paul constantly says in the New Testament, imitate me as I, imitate Christ. And so Paul's just saying you need to set that same kind of structure up in your leadership. Make sure those who are at the top or in the framework of leading and shepherding are people that you can imitate. So here's 3 quick things I think we take away from this passage. Sincere faith is formed within the local church as a community of healthy, ordered relationships. In 1 Timothy 3, Paul describes the church as a household of God. It implies shared life, structure, accountable relationships. The qualifications for these overseers and for the deacons are not abstract ideas. They're relational character patterns that shape community. We want that in our leadership because we want it in our church. It's a responsibility for all of us. It's to create and cultivate a community in which this kind of faith, a sincere faith, can be formed and sustained. And there needs to be a healthy order and sense of character in such leaders so that happens. 2, sincere faith is revealed both within the church and to those outside it through everyday integrity and faithfulness. Paul constantly hits on the external aspect. He says they must be above blame. They must have good reputation with outsiders. They must live consistently in character and relationships and self-control. There's a missional influence to how we see our lives, that we're concerned with doing it right here so that we can put the light on top of the hill for the world around us. We give a witness through our ordinary patterns, all of us do, not just leaders, when we live with integrity and faithfulness. And lastly, when we invest in a local church community, we do so that we can develop a sincere faith, so we can model and strengthen sincere faith in one another. Paul's concern is not that overseers and deacons are the only qualified, but he wants them to be examples of what the whole church should become. And this tells us why we invest in the church at all. The church, therefore, is not just a tradition. It's something we're investing in so our faith is formed in visible examples, in mutual accountability and faithful service. So order cultivates sincere faith, and structure develops missional impulse, and we invest in the local church for this reason. Now, we understand that all of this is more than just feeling a sense of calling. It's something that needs to be examined. It requires time, testing, judgment, and a track record that holds under pressure. No one wants a pilot chosen just because they sounded right in an interview. And we want evidence that they can carry weight when conditions change, that they can hold the airplane in a storm. That's Paul's point here. Leadership in the church is not to be grounded in charisma or the ability to grow a church, or perceived gifting or early enthusiasm. It's measured in their story, in their character over time. Not perfection, but the way they're progressing towards maturity so they can be trusted with others. And the goal is not just simply leadership structures. It's to bring about a framework of a church community where sincere faith in all of us becomes visible, formed, and strengthened. The church becomes a place where sincere faith is seen in ordinary lives, resourced through shared and accountable relationships, and lived out in mission with the gathered community. In that sense, overseers and deacons are not a separate category of spiritual people. They're not meant to be, ooh, those people are really spiritual. They're meant to be viable patterns and viable resources for who we as the whole church are becoming. People who long to have a sincere faith that is tangible, teachable, and reproducible.